Good morning, everybody. This is Xianliang in California with Morsels of a Thought number 1255. Today we are in grass soup. Zhang Xianliang. I don't know how to pronounce his name in Chinese, but I do know that the ZH sounds like a J, the X sounds like an SH, diphthong. Where'd the book go? Oh, thank you, Chloe. So, in case you'd like to see my cat, would you like to come up here, Chloe? Please? Please? Come on, Chloe. Would you come up here, please? Oh, we got a volunteer. Oh, sorry, Chloe. I didn't mean to pop you on the side of the ear. Goodness, this is a clone of Chloe. Her name is Fira. This is a Russian name. Fatima is her original name, which is an Islamic name. And Zia is the Anglo name that I came up with as her nickname. Okay, anyway, we're in California with Morsels of a Thought number 1255. This is a book about a man who spent 10 years in a prison camp in China in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution over there that killed millions of people. They think that 35 million people have passed from that particular horrible part of history. They called it liberation for a long time in China, according to the dictates of the Chinese government, and we now know more about it. It's not a good piece of history, but it is a very interesting look into the human condition. This man that spent all that time there, he wound up coming out of there with a diary that he was able to get past all the screeners with his life. He had to be able to make sure he didn't meet the firing squad for writing it. And he also had to make sure that he wrote it in code. So he would write 3 words. And currently we're on the journal entry that he called Hauled Dirt Clods, 12th of July, picked through greens, wrote eulogy, shine on crimson rays. Now, because of that particular political song, they let it go. Anyway, so page 35. Pull out all the stops. For a short time, the labor reform camps instituted a policy of not rationing grain, of eating to the limit, quote, end quote. This was in the few months when a slogan was circulated around the country that said, fill your bellies, eat as much as you can, pull out all the stops for more production. At the end of that year, when grain became scarce and rationing was imposed again, the old commissar handled it differently from the other bureaucrats we knew so well. They would have waved the red headlined document sent down from above, capital A, made an announcement to everyone, then simply instituted the rationing. Instead, the old commissar asked the troop leaders to gather all the convicts in an emergency meeting. It was right after breakfast, which we always took to our bunks to eat. He waited until every convict was there at the threshing ground and standing at attention. Then he ordered a group of cooks to go into the convicts' barracks. These were called numbers in the camps. They were to go from number to number, searching, ouch, for food. Ow! Sorry. After a long while, the cooks returned with all kinds of baskets containing the leftover steamed buns and rice that convicts had not finished eating. He had the cooks exhibit these things in the middle of the threshing ground. Then, with a face that was steel gray with anger, he pointed to the baskets and shouted, "A sin! A sin! Just look at that. We let you eat as much as you want, and you waste it. Don't you know that every grain of rice, every kernel of wheat is a farmer's drop of sweat and blood? All that work just to be wasted by you? Sinners, you're sinners." Starting from the next meal, every man gets put on rationing again. You kitchen workers, do you hear me? Fixed ration of rice at the next meal. China has an old proverb: the sins of heaven can be disregarded. There is nothing you can do about them anyway. It's the ones you bring on yourself that will get you in the end. Yes, you are responsible for the crimes you commit. So whose fault is it when you again have to tighten your belt and lock up your throat? One by one, we began to blame ourselves. Then we began to blame each other. Later, when the grain ration got smaller and smaller, when large numbers of people began to die, some convicts on the brink of death were still regretting their earlier sins. If they had not wasted so much grain before, surely there would still be enough to eat today. Surely it was our own fault that we were dying of starvation. When there wasn't enough grain, naturally you had to eat grass. Listening to the old commissar, it seemed that eating grass was part of China's traditional food culture. It's not. When we started eating grass, the old commissar instructed us: eating wild plants to get through times of scarcity is one of the inherent talents of us working people. Wang Baoshun ate bitter greens for 18 years. When Xu Pinggui finally arrived, Baoshun became his number one wife. This relates to a Tang Dynasty story and play. I didn't know that was a girl. Anyway, so what's the matter with wild plants? Back then, everybody ate them to get by. They ate them until they got greedy. Then they started eating fine vegetables. You all came here to be reformed, not to be landlords and capitalists. So everyone here eats grass. Otherwise, you won't get properly reformed. Now, I want to make a note that wanted to say something about this. It was something about that I wanted to say something about. Oh, bitter melons or bitter, hold on a second. Bitter greens for 18 years. Oh, okay. So anyway, bitter greens. Okay. Before long, the convicts had no energy to work. Some simply lay down in the middle of a field. Then there were those who pretended to be dead dogs and didn't even go out into the field. A counter-revolutionary theory went round about that time to the effect that the men had no energy because they were eating nothing but grass. When he heard it, the old commissar refuted this idiotic idea. Who says that grass hasn't got any nutrition, that you can't get any energy from it? Okay. Livestock eat grass, don't they? And don't they put out a lot more work than you do? Oh, gosh. Convicts who had committed criminal offenses and a small number of historical counter-revolutionaries were the only ones who had some doubts about this assertion. They continued to pass their counter-revolutionary theory around underground. Among the intellectuals, not one did not express utter belief and servility to the old commissar. This was particularly true of rightists and those among us who were zealously reforming themselves by extolling the short history of the United Bolshevik Communist Party and dialectical materialism. These people had the highest respect for him. It didn't matter if his lesson was about lumps of steel or the traditional food culture of China. His was a brand new way of thinking. If these intellectuals, trying so hard to reform their worldview, did not follow his example, then whose were they to follow? Intellectuals who came to the camps to be reformed had long since lost the ability to think independently for themselves. They had endured endless struggle and criticism sessions, study sessions, reading groups, and they had lost self-confidence. They were dispirited and weakened. With his ironclad assurance, his crude logic that permitted no doubts, this representative of workers, peasants, and soldiers quickly prevailed over their timidity. The brains of China's intellectuals were turned into public toilets long ago, to the point that 6 years later, Jiang, that's the wife of Mao Zedong, could even throw her menstrual pad inside. The lessons of the old commissar had actually College was where Zhang attended university. So she spoke English, obviously, or some. The lessons of the old commissar had a considerable amount of knowledge that differed from what was written in books. But at that time, one could only doubt what was in a book anyway. The capitalist class was the only one with any book education, and now we were to be re educated by workers, peasants, and soldiers. Knowledge turned out to have a class nature. For example, capitalist class knowledge said analogies between man and metal were inaccurate, also that man's intestines and stomach were different from those of livestock. Knowledge of the class with no capital, i.e., proletariat knowledge, saw man and metal as the same type of thing and recognized a commonality between men and livestock. Which were you to believe? You had to believe the latter. It was not a question of common sense, it was a question of class. What's more, a lot of things that capitalist scholars said could not be done had been made reality through the guidance of the proletariat worldview. Experts said they were impossible, but the common sense of workers, peasants, and soldiers made them happen. Take this labor reform camp right before your eyes as an example. A few years ago, many people had thought that the land was unsuitable for establishing a large-scale state farm run by the central government. Even Soviet experts even Soviet experts argued that this place could not be cultivated. But the old commissar brought in a dozen cadres and workers, and they turned white salt flats into fields. Weeds still flourished in those fields. The land was bumpy and uneven, and the whole project had cost innumerable lives. But you could not deny that the fields produced crops. From a distance, it looked as though the hoary salt flats were clothed in green. All this was undeniable. It made you sigh and say that what you had studied in the past was not complete. They were lacunae. There were lacunae. What happened? Oh, sorry. It made you acquiesce and agree that you simply must start again by being re-educated by worker peasant soldiers like this old commissar. Chinese intellectuals who have been educated in old-fashioned patriotism and nationalism have a trait that verges on fetishism. They have only to see construction projects such as factories, oil fields, and farms springing up on what was originally raw land, and they prostrate themselves in admiration. They see these as symbols of development, of an advancing country. They never consider the price that is paid or their effect on the natural environment. In the evenings, when the moon was so bright it obscured the stars, on a threshing ground washed by the fragrance of rain, we convicts would sit in rows before the old commissar and listen to him like children listening to some uncle tell a story. He told us of things gone by. He said, "Used to be I couldn't even read the character for big. Up in Shanbei." Okay, the character for big looks like a stick across, like this, and two legs. So it's like this and this. So it's like this and this. That's all it looks like. Okay? The word for big looks like a man holding his hands out and his feet spread apart. Okay, so I couldn't even read the word for big. Up in Shanbei, when I followed Liu Zhidan into the revolution, I'd paste on the glue and he would stick up the slogans. Then he began to teach me a couple of the characters on those slogans. So I began getting a few words, slowly learning them. So now the fact is, if you intellectuals give me a test, I might not pass. Why? Tried my best to learn from revolutionaries, that's why. What I know is revolution. A lot more useful than what you're going to find in books. Oh my gosh. With this great warmth of feeling, he often mentioned the famous revolutionary Liu Zhidan. Liu Zhidan was a good man. Never mind that he was born into a landlord's family, little master of a landlord he was, but when he took to revolution, he wasn't afraid to die. He'd fight on the rivers and in the mountains for us poor people. What's that say to us? It says that a person just has to try. Doesn't matter what family background he has. If he works at it, no one can stop him. These words would stroke us like a warm, gentle breeze, and for a short time they would revive starving, exhausted, hopeless men. Although they had lost any pride in their past, although their educations were clearly a disaster in light of the reality around them, there might still be a future. Listening to these heartening words, convicts from bad family backgrounds would feel tears come to their eyes. I was one of those who sincerely admired the old commissar. He was different from the other leaders with whom I had come in contact, men who appeared profound but didn't have a thing inside. Every word he spoke seemed spontaneous and new. My remaining vestiges of poetic sensitivity told me that he was truly an artist. He was a model leader among workers, peasants, and soldiers. I'd heard him give a number of reports, usually just after I had drunk grass soup and didn't feel quite as hungry as usual, and eventually I had the idea of writing about him. After all, didn't I have a pen? Moreover, it was clear to me that some people were receiving special treatment. Certain convicts did nothing but easy jobs. Since envy was unpleasant, it occurred to me that I too should belong to the ranks of those looked after. I have never been athletic, even when I was younger. By this time, there were only 44 kilos of me left, and I was even less nimble. I was no match against others when it came to eating greens, and when it came to hard labor, I was never going to surpass the rest. I had to avoid that path if I wanted to preserve my own little life. Most people are smart enough to display their better side and to hide their faults. I knew that the only usefulness I had was the ability to write. That was the one pitifully meager talent I had learned in the world outside with a capital O. If one was to write in this labor reform camp, the ideal scenario was to make this old commissar the main character. I decided to write an article that sang his praises and extolled his virtue. Never mind that he truly was worth writing about. One day, after the old commissar had finished his lesson, I bravely marched up and gave a troop leader under him a message describing this aspiration. Nobody ever gave me an answer. Nobody declared any position on it. But several days later, the troop leader suddenly plucked me out of the main work troop. He said that I was not to go with the rest of the men to the big fields. Instead, I was to do the work that these first entries in the diary mention. Good jobs, like hauling dirt clods and picking through greens. It was clear that I had been elevated to the status of being looked after. And so it became imperative that I use my free time when I was not hauling clods or picking through greens to throw myself into writing with all the grateful fervor I could muster. Since I was much more practiced at writing than at hauling, I had the article written within a few nights. By now, I had already begun to correct my final draft. Isn't that great? So he's a smart guy. So the next diary entry is going to be the one from the following day that he's going to talk about, and that will be on page 44. So we will begin next week on page 45. Alrighty. So as we can tell, this is a very sad story of a part of China that many people want to hide. I would say that there is an interesting character in the way the Chinese culture allowed the Cultural Revolution to take place. Now, I know that my late uncle Timothy, was very much enamored of Deng Xiaoping, and he also liked Zhou Enlai. But some of these people went into exile later on. Deng Xiaoping passed around the same time as Lady Di did, and I just remember that, and that people couldn't pronounce his name because Deng Xiaoping is Deng Xiaoping, but people said Deng, and nobody wanted to say it the other way, and Anyway, so I don't know very much about that. I don't know very much about it at all. So I'm curious about this sort of stuff, and I found that this book spoke to me when I was walking through the library one day. And this particular volume that I purchased was from one of those online used book stores. So I got that, and it's apparently a library copy from a city called New Canaan, and I don't know where that is. But as you can see, we've got New Canaan is the name of a religious town in the Bible. I believe Canaan, anyway, is. And we've got religion, we've got culture, we've got languages, we've got history, all in our backbone as human beings. And I think that a lot of history can come down to human history. We have human history, we've got selfishness as part of our lives, but we've also got virtue. And my point in doing these morsels of a thought every day is to impart a little real wisdom into the world so that we can know what the right things are to do. According to the fortune cookie that I will forever credit to that fortune cookie was virtue, knowledge, wisdom is knowing the right thing to do, and virtue is the doing of it. So we've got virtue in the world, and we all know what the right thing to do is sometimes. Sometimes we don't. So let's find out. Okay, old Kinderhook.